Within the Kybalion are 7 principles said to govern everything from thought to destiny, and those who mastered them didn't just survive history, they shaped it. If you emotionally react to reality constantly, you unknowingly give it the authority over your mind. And whatever controls your mind eventually controls your life. Most people spend years fighting circumstances while secretly feeding them with fear, obsession, attention, and emotional surrender. The Hermetic initiates believed this was the true prison of humanity, not chains. Conditioning today, you are about to uncover the hidden Hermetic principles behind the Kybalion and the ancient teachings of mental mastery that inspired generations of mystics, philosophers, and seekers. You will discover why ignoring reality never meant denying the world, but refusing to emotionally worship appearances. You will learn why fear strengthens unwanted outcomes, how attention feeds reality, why identity silently organizes your future, and how the final Hermetic law may completely change the way you interpret existence itself, because according to the ancient initiates, reality first moves invisibly, then physically. Before we begin, try something unusual. Think about the problem currently occupying most of your mind. Now ask yourself honestly, how much of your suffering comes from the event itself, and how much comes from the meaning your mind repeatedly attaches to it? The Hermetic teachers believed most people do not experience reality directly. They experience their interpretation of reality, and once an interpretation becomes emotional, it begins shaping behavior, perception, attention, and eventually destiny itself. Watch your reactions carefully as we continue. They may reveal more than your circumstances ever could. Chapter 1. The Silent Legacy of Hermes Trismegistus. There are names buried beneath history that refuse to die. They survive wars, collapsing empires, burning libraries, and the arrogance of modern certainty. One of those names is Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great. A figure suspended somewhere between man, myth, prophet, and divine messenger. Some believed he was an Egyptian priest. Others believed he was a fusion of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, the keeper of wisdom, writing, mathematics, and hidden laws. Yet what made his name dangerous was not who he was. It was what he taught for centuries: secret societies, kings, alchemists, philosophers, and mystics guarded fragments of Hermetic wisdom, as if human civilization itself could be destabilized by ordinary people discovering it. In hidden chambers beneath Egyptian temples, initiates were tested before they were allowed to hear certain teachings. Silence was part of the initiation, not because the teachings were evil, but because the unprepared mind would distort them into destruction. Knowledge magnifies character. An old Hermetic story tells of a young seeker who traveled across deserts to meet an initiate living near Alexandria. The seeker arrived exhausted, demanding the secret to power, wealth, and influence. The old initiate poured water into a bowl until it overflowed onto the floor. The young man protested immediately. "You are wasting water." The old man smiled softly. "And you are overflowing with noise." The seeker waited in confusion, then the initiate whispered, "Truth enters only where pride has become quiet." That was the first lesson. Ancient Hermetic teachings did not begin with controlling reality. They began with controlling perception. The initiates believed humanity suffered from a kind of spiritual sleepwalking. Most people moved through life, reacting automatically, hypnotized by fear, emotional impulses, social conditioning, and appearances. They chased symbols while remaining blind to causes. They sought external control while remaining strangers to their own minds. Hermeticism taught that the visible world was only the surface layer of reality. Beneath events existed patterns, beneath patterns existed consciousness, and beneath consciousness existed divine mind itself. This terrified ancient rulers because a human being who mastered inner perception became difficult to manipulate. Such a person no longer reacted blindly to fear, propaganda, chaos, or temptation. They became inwardly sovereign. Even today, modern society rewards distraction more than awareness. The average person wakes each morning and immediately absorbs anxiety, opinions, conflict, endless stimulation, and emotional noise. Their attention is scattered before their own thoughts even become clear. Ancient Hermetic initiates would have called this a form of psychic slavery. Attention determines direction. The old teachings insisted that consciousness is shaped through repeated focus. Whatever dominates your inner world eventually begins organizing your outer behavior. Not magically in the childish sense, but psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and behaviorally. Fear changes posture. Bitterness alters perception. Gratitude changes interpretation. Hope strengthens endurance. Inner states silently influence decisions long before results appear externally. A merchant in ancient Egypt once visited a temple initiate after losing nearly everything during years of political instability. He begged for rituals to restore his fortune. Instead of giving him mystical ceremonies, the initiate asked him a strange question. "What do you think about repeatedly when you are alone?" The merchant answered honestly. "Loss, failure, fear, regret." The initiate nodded slowly. "Then you are worshipping collapse." The merchant became offended, but the initiate continued. "A man moves toward whatever dominates his inner altar." That sentence haunted the merchant for years. Many people misunderstand Hermetic teachings because they reduce them into fantasies of instant manifestation. But the deeper teachings were never about escaping reality. They were about transforming the inner architecture through which reality is experienced. The Hermetic masters understood something modern psychology would later rediscover. Repeated thoughts become emotional patterns. Emotional patterns become behaviors. Behaviors become circumstances. And circumstances reinforce identity. The cycle continues quietly. This is why ancient initiates guarded mental discipline so intensely. They understood that the mind is not merely a passive observer. It is an active participant in human experience. A fearful mind interprets neutral situations as threats. A disciplined mind sees opportunities hidden inside difficulty. Two people can experience the same external event, yet walk away with completely different destinies because consciousness filters interpretation. Hermes Trismegistus became legendary because his teachings united spirituality, philosophy, psychology, and cosmic symbolism into one living system. The Hermetic path taught that humanity contains a forgotten divine spark buried beneath conditioning and illusion. Awakening was not about becoming something new. It was about remembering something ancient within yourself. The priests described this awakening as the second birth, a rebirth of perception. Not everyone was prepared for it. Some initiates abandoned the teachings because true self-observation is uncomfortable. It is easier to blame fate than confront internal disorder. Easier to curse the darkness than examine the habits feeding it. The Hermetic path demanded radical responsibility, not guilt. Responsibility, there is a difference. Guilt weakens action. Responsibility restores power. The old masters knew that once a person understands the relationship between consciousness and experience, excuses begin dissolving. Slowly, painfully, honestly. the initiate starts realizing how much of life has been unconsciously shaped by repeated emotional patterns, inherited beliefs, unresolved fears, and habitual reactions. This realization can feel terrifying at first, but it can also become liberation, because if consciousness influences experience, then awareness itself becomes transformative. The ancient temples understood something most people still ignore. Your inner world is never staying still. It is either being shaped deliberately or unconsciously programmed by external forces. There is no neutral state for long. Every conversation, environment, fear, obsession, and repeated thought leaves impressions upon the mind. The Hermetic initiate learned to guard those impressions carefully, not with paranoia, with awareness. The teachings of Hermes survived because they addressed something timeless within humanity. Every generation struggles with illusion, distraction, fear, ego, and suffering. Every generation searches for meaning beyond material accumulation, and every generation secretly senses that reality contains deeper layers than ordinary perception reveals. The Hermetic masters did not ask people to worship them. They asked people to wake up. That was the forbidden part, because awakened people become difficult to control. And perhaps that is why the legacy of Hermes Trismegistus still echoes across centuries like a whisper traveling through stone corridors beneath forgotten temples. Not because the teachings promised fantasy, but because they demanded transformation. The first step remains the same today as it was thousands of years ago. Observe your mind honestly. Watch your repeated thoughts. Watch your emotional habits. Watch what dominates your attention when nobody is watching you. Hidden there are the silent forces shaping your experience more than you realize. The ancient initiates understood this deeply. Thought is never truly idle. It becomes architecture. Chapter 2. The principle of mentalism. What if reality responds more to consciousness than circumstances? Most people dismiss that question immediately because they have been trained to believe the external world is the only true power. They believe conditions create identity. Money creates confidence. Success creates belief. Recognition creates self-worth. But the Hermetic masters taught the reverse. Consciousness precedes condition. Identity shapes interpretation. Inner assumptions silently organize behavior long before results appear. This became the foundation of the first Hermetic principle found within the Kybalion. The all is mind. At first glance, the statement sounds abstract, almost poetic, but ancient initiates treated it as a practical law governing human experience. They believed the visible world emerged from deeper layers of consciousness, just as a building first exists within the architect's mind before becoming physical structure. Everything begins invisibly. The Egyptian mystery schools guarded this teaching carefully because they understood how dangerous unconscious thinking could become. Within the initiation chambers beneath certain temples, students were trained not merely to memorize ideas, but to observe the mechanics of their own minds. They learned that repeated thought creates emotional atmosphere. Emotional atmosphere shapes perception, perception influences action, and action reinforces destiny. A frightened mind sees danger everywhere, an awakened mind sees patterns. An old Hermetic parable tells of two travelers walking through the same city during a season of famine. One man saw only hostility, scarcity, and desperation. He distrusted every stranger and interpreted every delay as proof the world was against him. The second traveler saw suffering too, but he also noticed generosity, resilience, hidden opportunities, and people quietly helping one another survive. Same city, Different realities, the Hermetic masters would say. Both men unconsciously projected internal states onto the same external environment. Their consciousness filtered experience differently. Modern psychology now echoes similar truths. Two people can receive identical criticism, yet one collapses emotionally while another grows stronger from it. The event matters, but interpretation matters more. The mind is never neutral. It is constantly assigning meaning. Meaning shapes emotion. Emotion shapes behavior. Behavior shapes outcome. This is why the ancient initiates practiced mental discipline so rigorously. They understood that thoughts are not harmless background noise. Repeated thoughts slowly become assumptions. Assumptions become identity. Identity begins directing life automatically. Most people never notice this process happening. A man repeatedly tells himself he is unlucky. Eventually he stops taking risks. Another secretly believes nobody values him, so he unconsciously tolerates disrespect. Another assumes success belongs only to others, so opportunities feel intimidating rather than inviting. The assumption becomes self-fulfilling, not because of mystical fantasy alone, but because consciousness silently organizes perception, energy, emotion, posture, persistence, and behavior. The Hermetic initiates knew this thousands of years ago. That is why mental discipline was treated as sacred power. Inside certain Egyptian temples, students reportedly spent years learning silence before being entrusted with deeper teachings. Silence revealed thought patterns usually hidden beneath distraction. Once external noise faded, the initiate confronted the chaos within their own consciousness. Many were shocked by what they discovered. Restlessness, fear, jealousy, endless mental repetition. The ancient masters believed a person who could not govern thought could never truly govern life. One initiate recorded a story about sitting alone in darkness within a temple chamber for several days. At first he became overwhelmed by fear and agitation. Old memories surfaced, regrets echoed loudly, anxiety multiplied, but eventually something changed. Beneath the noise, he noticed awareness itself, a deeper observing presence untouched by emotional storms. That realization transformed him forever. You are not every passing thought. You are the awareness observing them. This became one of the hidden psychological powers behind Hermetic practice. Once a person stops identifying completely with fear-based thinking, they regain the ability to redirect consciousness deliberately. This is the beginning of mental sovereignty. The Kybalion teaches that the universe itself is mental in nature, but this principle was never meant to encourage denial of physical reality. Rather, it pointed toward the hidden relationship between mind and experience. Your internal world continuously shapes how you perceive, interpret, and respond to life. A hopeless mind misses possibilities. A disciplined mind notices them. That changes everything. The ancient priests understood that most suffering becomes amplified through unconscious interpretation. Fear feeds imagination. Bitterness reshapes memory. Anxiety predicts disaster before it arrives. The mind becomes both creator and prison depending on how it is used. This is why Hermetic teachings emphasized observation before transformation. You cannot master what you refuse to examine, so begin there. Watch your dominant thoughts daily, not occasionally. Daily, observe the emotional atmosphere you repeatedly rehearse internally. Notice which assumptions quietly govern your reactions, relationships, decisions, and expectations. Most people never perform this inner examination, yet they wonder why the same emotional cycles repeat endlessly throughout their lives. The Hermetic path begins with awareness, not force, not denial, awareness. Because the moment you become conscious of repeated thought patterns, you stop being completely ruled by them. And perhaps that is the deeper meaning hidden beneath the ancient phrase whispered through mystery schools for centuries. The All is Mind, Chapter 3, Hermes Trismegistus and the Hidden Architecture of Reality. There are figures in history so mysterious that civilizations cannot agree whether they were men, myths, or something in between. Hermes Trismegistus was one of them. In the torchlit chambers of ancient Egypt, priests whispered his name with reverence as though speaking it too loudly would disturb hidden laws sleeping beneath reality itself. Some called him the thrice great Hermes, master of mind, cosmos, and divine wisdom. Others believed he carried knowledge older than kingdoms. Yet what made his teachings dangerous was not magic. It was awareness. The ancient Hermetic texts did not describe reality as fixed stone. They described it as layered perception. The outer world was seen as a reflection interpreted through consciousness itself. This was the secret hidden beneath temple initiation rites. A fearful mind and a disciplined mind could stand inside the same world yet experience entirely different realities. One saw punishment, the other saw possibility. One collapsed beneath chaos, the other remained internally sovereign. Same world, different consciousness, different outcome. An old Hermetic parable tells of a young initiate brought blindfolded into an underground chamber beneath a temple near Alexandria. The elders placed before him 2 cups. One contained wine, the other poison. Choose carefully, they warned. Terrified, the initiate froze. His fear distorted perception. His breathing became unstable. Sweat covered his palms. He imagined death before action. Hours passed before the oldest priest finally removed the blindfold and revealed the truth. Both cups contained water. The lesson was brutal. Fear had poisoned him long before any liquid touched his lips. This is why the Hermetic traditions placed such importance on inner mastery. They understood something modern society rarely considers: perception is never passive. Human beings do not merely observe reality. They participate in it through interpretation, expectation, emotional state, and attention. The mind becomes a lens shaping the meaning of every experience. A suspicious mind discovers betrayal everywhere. A hopeless mind notices only obstacles. A disciplined mind detects opportunities invisible to others. The Corpus Hermeticum repeatedly points toward this truth through symbolic language. The divine mind exists within humanity, but it remains buried beneath confusion, emotional reactivity, and unconscious conditioning. Awakening, therefore, was not about becoming something new. It was remembrance. The initiate was taught to strip away illusion until consciousness itself became clear. Few understand this today. Modern people often search endlessly outside themselves for certainty, while neglecting the architecture of perception guiding every decision they make. They attempt to change circumstances without understanding the consciousness interacting with those circumstances. But Hermetic wisdom moved in the opposite direction. Transform perception first. External experience begins reorganizing afterward. A merchant in ancient Greece once traveled to Egypt seeking the secret of power, spoken of in rumors across Mediterranean ports. He expected hidden rituals, rare symbols, perhaps forbidden chants. Instead, an old teacher handed him a broom and instructed him to sweep the temple floors for 30 days without complaint. The merchant became furious. "I traveled across oceans for wisdom," he protested. The old teacher replied quietly, "And your anger revealed why you are not ready to receive it." Every irritation exposed the condition of the mind. Every reaction revealed unconscious slavery. The temple was not training obedience, it was training awareness. That changes everything, because once a person begins observing perception itself, they discover how frequently emotions distort reality. Anxiety predicts disasters that never arrive. Pride blinds judgment. Resentment reshapes memory. Desire exaggerates appearances. Fear narrows possibility. The world begins resembling the state of consciousness interpreting it. This is why Hermetic initiates guarded mental environments carefully. They understood that repeated impressions slowly hardened into identity. Identity shaped behavior, behavior shaped destiny, invisible causes, visible consequences. A distracted mind becomes a distracted life. A peaceful mind perceives differently. A disciplined mind creates differently. The ancients knew this long before psychology gave it modern language. Today, neuroscience discusses cognitive bias and subconscious conditioning. Hermeticism expressed the same insight symbolically thousands of years ago through initiation stories and metaphysical principles. Different vocabulary, same warning: protect the mind. One forgotten manuscript describes initiates spending days in silence before entering advanced teachings. No unnecessary speech, no gossip, no emotional indulgence. At first this seemed extreme to outsiders, but the purpose was simple. Noise weakens awareness, constant reaction fragments perception, stillness sharpens it, and in stillness people begin noticing something unsettling. Most thoughts are not consciously chosen. They arrive automatically from memory, fear, social conditioning, and repetition. The Hermetic path therefore demanded deliberate observation of thought itself. Not suppression, observation. Because observed thoughts lose unconscious control, this becomes deeply practical in ordinary life. Two individuals lose the same opportunity. One spirals into bitterness and defeat. The other interprets the event as redirection and adapts intelligently. Same circumstance, different inner architecture, different future. Hermetic wisdom insists that consciousness does not merely react to life. It organizes experience through meaning. The ancient masters knew perception was a creative instrument. And perhaps that is why Hermes Trismegistus became both admired and feared across centuries. His teachings challenged the comforting illusion that human beings are powerless victims drifting through existence. Instead, they suggested something far more demanding. Internal awareness carries responsibility. To govern perception is to participate consciously in reality itself. That realization unsettles many people because it removes excuses. If attention shapes experience, then scattered attention creates scattered lives. If emotional states distort perception, then unconscious reactions quietly shape destiny. The responsibility becomes personal. But so does the freedom. A calm mind notices doors panic cannot see. A disciplined mind resists emotional manipulation. An awakened mind recognizes that reality is interpreted long before it is experienced. The Hermetic sages believed every human being stood between two worlds, the visible world of events and the invisible world of consciousness shaping interpretation. Most people became trapped in the outer world alone, endlessly reacting without understanding the inner forces directing those reactions. The initiate sought balance between both. This is why inner awakening was considered sacred, not because it granted supernatural powers, but because it restored clarity. And clarity changes everything. The practical lesson remains timeless. Treat perception as a creative instrument. Observe your interpretations carefully. Notice emotional filters shaping judgment. Watch how repeated thoughts influence behavior. The quality of awareness quietly influences the quality of lived experience. The ancients were not merely studying the cosmos, they were studying consciousness itself, and they believed the greatest hidden architecture in existence was the human mind. Chapter 4. The dangerous misinterpretation of ignoring reality. Few modern phrases have been more dangerously misunderstood than the idea of ignoring reality. Entire generations now repeat these words without wisdom, as though denying problems automatically transforms them into miracles. But ancient Hermetic teachings never encouraged blindness. They warned against enslavement to appearances. There is a difference. A starving man cannot pretend hunger away. A wounded person cannot deny pain into healing. A kingdom collapsing into corruption cannot be saved through empty positive thinking. The ancients understood material conditions were real experiences within human life. What they rejected was unconscious submission to appearances as absolute truth. That distinction changes everything. A story from late antiquity tells of two students studying under a Hermetic philosopher in Alexandria. During a season of famine, both young men lost nearly everything they owned. The first became consumed by despair. Day after day he repeated, "My life is ruined." His mind narrowed. Fear controlled his decisions. He withdrew from opportunity, distrusted others, and eventually collapsed emotionally before circumstances had fully defeated him. The second student also suffered hardship, but his teacher instructed him differently. "Do not worship appearances," the old philosopher warned. "Conditions change. Consciousness directs response." The young man still acknowledged difficulty. He still worked, adapted, and endured uncertainty. But internally he refused to identify himself with temporary conditions. Instead of repeating defeat, he maintained discipline over interpretation. Months later, while others remained psychologically broken, he recognized opportunities invisible to those consumed by panic. Same famine, different consciousness. Modern culture often confuses Hermetic principles with fantasy escapism. People hear phrases like "ignore reality" and assume the teaching means denying facts. But Hermetic wisdom was never about pretending problems do not exist. It was about refusing to let circumstances dictate inner identity. That is a profound difference. The Stoics taught similarly. Marcus Aurelius faced war, plague, betrayal, and political chaos, yet constantly reminded himself that external events alone did not determine suffering. Interpretation shaped suffering. This did not mean he ignored the plague devastating Rome. It meant he refused to surrender inner sovereignty to external disorder. The danger appears when people attempt to use metaphysical ideas as emotional anesthesia. They avoid responsibility, suppress fear instead of understanding it, and mistake passivity for spiritual mastery. But avoidance weakens consciousness. Awareness strengthens it. A man drowning in debt who endlessly repeats, "I am wealthy," while continuing destructive habits misunderstands the principle entirely. Thought without disciplined action becomes fantasy. Hermeticism demanded alignment between perception, emotion, behavior, and awareness. The teachings were practical before mystical. Ancient initiates trained for years because they understood something uncomfortable. The human mind naturally drifts toward illusion. Desire distorts judgment. Fear exaggerates danger. Ego protects comforting lies. Without discipline, consciousness becomes chaotic. That chaos becomes suffering. One forgotten temple exercise required initiates to sit beside flowing water for hours while observing every emotional reaction arising within them. Not suppressing, observing. Impatience, restlessness, pride, anxiety. The purpose was simple. Before mastering reality, master perception. Because the greatest illusion is often internal, this becomes painfully visible in everyday life. Some people remain trapped in destructive relationships because they ignore obvious truth in favor of comforting fantasy. Others refuse financial reality until crisis forces confrontation. Some mistake temporary emotional highs for transformation while their habits remain unchanged beneath the surface. Blind denial is not power, clarity is power. Hermetic wisdom encourages people to see conditions clearly without emotionally surrendering to them. A storm exists, but panic weakens navigation. Illness exists, but hopelessness accelerates suffering. Difficulty exists, but identity need not collapse alongside circumstance. The mind must remain larger than the condition. This is why the ancient teachers emphasized emotional neutrality so heavily. Emotional extremes distort perception. Fear magnifies obstacles. Desperation clouds intelligence. Anger narrows awareness. But calm observation creates space for intelligent action. The Hermetic initiate learned to face reality directly while refusing to become psychologically imprisoned by it. That balance is rare today. Modern society swings between two extremes: cynical materialism or reckless spiritual escapism. One side worships circumstances as absolute power, the other denies circumstances entirely. Hermetic philosophy walked a narrower path between them. Observe reality honestly, but remember consciousness shapes response, interpretation, resilience, and direction. The outer world influences you, but the inner world interprets what that influence means. A disciplined mind remains flexible during uncertainty because it understands appearances are temporary. Conditions shift, economies change, relationships evolve, emotional weather passes. The person who attaches identity entirely to external circumstances becomes fragile. The person who develops inner stability becomes adaptable. And adaptability is power. Perhaps this is the true meaning behind the misunderstood phrase, ignore reality. Not blindness, not denial, but refusal to emotionally worship temporary appearances as final truth. Because history repeatedly proves appearances deceive, empires collapse unexpectedly, falsures become beginnings, moments of suffering awaken hidden strength. And some of humanity's greatest transformations began precisely when individuals stopped allowing visible conditions to define invisible possibility. The ancient Hermetic sages understood this deeply. Reality was not meant to be denied. It was meant to be understood beyond surface appearance. Beneath every condition existed consciousness, interpreting, reacting, choosing, and shaping the next step forward. That is the hidden responsibility and the hidden freedom. Chapter 5. Plato's Cave and the Prison of Perception. In ancient Greece, initiates entering certain philosophical schools were not immediately taught answers. Instead, they were taught to doubt what seemed obvious. Plato understood something dangerous about the human mind. Most people never truly see reality. They only see interpretations layered over reality, like shadows moving across a cave wall, while prisoners mistake those shadows for life itself. The terrifying part is this: many never realize the chains exist. They defend the illusion because familiarity feels safer than truth. Plato's allegory of the cave was never merely philosophy. It was psychological prophecy. Imagine men chained underground since childhood, forced to stare at a wall while shadows flicker before them from a hidden fire behind their backs. To them, the shadows become truth, identity, history, and certainty. Then one prisoner escapes and sees sunlight for the first time. The world outside overwhelms him. Reality feels painful at first, because illusion had become comfort. Most people live exactly this way. They inherit fears, beliefs, limitations, and assumptions from family, society, media, and emotional wounds, then mistake those inherited patterns for objective truth. The prison is invisible. A man experiences betrayal in his youth and unconsciously decides people cannot be trusted. Years later, he calls himself realistic, not realizing his perception filters every interaction through suspicion. A woman repeatedly experiences disappointment and begins believing happiness never lasts. Eventually, her nervous system expects loss before joy even fully arrives. The external world appears to confirm these assumptions, but the confirmation comes through interpretation as much as circumstance. Consciousness quietly edits reality. This is why two people can live through identical events, yet emerge with entirely different destinies. One interprets hardship as evidence of defeat. Another interprets the same hardship as initiation into wisdom. One becomes bitter, the other becomes sovereign. Same world, different mind. Ancient Greek philosophers understood that perception is never passive, it participates. The mind is not merely observing reality, it is continuously organizing it, selecting it, emotionally coloring it. Fear magnifies threat, gratitude magnifies opportunity, shame magnifies rejection, love magnifies meaning. What you repeatedly feel begins shaping what you repeatedly notice. The cave deepens. A merchant in Alexandria once lost nearly everything during a season of political unrest. His friends collapsed into panic, convinced ruin had arrived permanently. Yet the old merchant remained strangely calm. When questioned, he answered, "Circumstances are loud, truth is quiet." While others reacted emotionally, he studied patterns patiently. Months later, opportunities invisible to fearful minds appeared before him. He rebuilt his fortune while others remained trapped in despair. His advantage was not luck. It was perception disciplined against emotional distortion. Most suffering begins with interpretation. The Hermetic teachings later echoed this same truth through different language. The mind shapes experience because consciousness filters existence before behavior ever emerges. A fearful mind creates fearful decisions. An exhausted mind notices only obstacles. A resentful mind unknowingly searches for betrayal. Inner atmosphere alters external navigation. That changes everything. Modern people often believe manipulation only happens politically or socially, yet the deepest manipulation happens internally, through unconscious thought repetition. A person repeats, "Nothing ever works for me," for 20 years, then wonders why reality feels heavy. Another repeats, "I always struggle," and slowly the nervous system organizes around struggle itself. The prison walls become psychological architecture. Plato warned humanity about this thousands of years ago. The philosopher's journey was not merely intellectual. It was transformational. To leave the cave meant abandoning comforting illusions about oneself and the world. That process remains painful today because identity attaches itself to familiar suffering. Many people secretly fear freedom because freedom requires responsibility for perception, and responsibility terrifies the unconscious mind. A powerful silence enters life when you begin questioning automatic assumptions. Suddenly you notice how often emotion creates false conclusions. You realize exhaustion once convinced you life was hopeless. You notice anxiety predicting disasters that never arrive. You recognize how many conflicts began not with reality itself, but with interpretation layered over reality. The chains weaken there. Ancient initiates trained themselves to pause before reacting because they understood something modern culture forgets. Reaction is often hypnosis. Immediate emotional interpretation traps consciousness inside conditioned patterns. Awareness breaks the spell. A Stoic teacher once told his students, "Events do not disturb men. Their judgments about events disturb them." Centuries later, neuroscience would uncover similar truths about cognitive framing and emotional conditioning. Ancient wisdom and modern psychology continue meeting in the same hidden chamber. Truth leaves footprints everywhere. The world outside Plato's cave was not created by wishful thinking. It required courage to perceive differently. Hermetic wisdom never taught blind denial of reality. It taught mastery over the mind interpreting reality. There is a profound difference. One path creates delusion. The other creates sovereignty. The disciplined mind sees clearly, so begin simply. Observe how often your emotions narrate reality before facts even appear. Notice recurring assumptions about money, relationships, aging, success, rejection, and possibility. Watch how the mind instantly labels situations before understanding them. Awareness itself becomes liberation. Question the shadows daily. Because the greatest prison was never built from stone. It was built from unquestioned perception, and the door has always been inside the mind. Chapter 6. The Secret of Mental Transmutation. Deep within Hermetic teachings existed a practice more guarded than ritual, more feared than prophecy, and more transformative than philosophy itself. It was called mental transmutation, the ability to transform inner states deliberately instead of becoming enslaved by them. Ancient initiates understood a truth modern humanity rarely practices. Emotion is energy awaiting direction. Left unconscious, it becomes destruction. Guided consciously, it becomes power. Most people attempt to control life while remaining unable to control their own reactions. That is the hidden contradiction. In certain Hermetic traditions, students were not trusted with deeper teachings until they demonstrated emotional discipline under pressure. A teacher might insult them publicly, delay rewards intentionally, or create frustrating obstacles simply to observe whether emotion controlled consciousness. The purpose was not cruelty, it was revelation. Anyone can appear wise in comfort. True mastery appears during agitation. Pressure reveals the real ruler within. The Kybalion taught that vibration can be transmuted, fear can become awareness, anger can become disciplined movement, despair can become insight. But this transformation does not happen automatically. It requires conscious interruption of emotional momentum. Imagine a blacksmith working with molten metal. Fire itself is neither good nor evil. Uncontrolled, it destroys. Directed carefully, it forges swords, tools, and armor. Emotion behaves the same way. Anger uncontrolled becomes violence, bitterness, and chaos. Anger directed becomes boundaries, courage, and decisive action. Fear uncontrolled becomes paralysis. Fear understood becomes alertness and preparation. The energy itself is neutral. An old Hermetic story tells of an initiate walking through the desert with his teacher beneath unbearable heat. After hours of silence, the initiate exploded in frustration, accusing the teacher of cruelty and pointless suffering. The old teacher calmly handed him water and said, "You believe the desert created your anger. The desert only revealed it." The initiate never forgot the lesson. Life often exposes what already exists within consciousness. Most reactions are rehearsed patterns. Modern people frequently believe emotions simply happen to them, yet ancient initiates viewed emotions differently. They saw emotional states as currents that could be redirected through awareness, breathing, attention, interpretation, and disciplined thought. This did not mean suppression. Suppressed emotion becomes poison beneath the surface. Hermetic mastery meant observing emotion without surrendering identity to it. Observe, redirect. Refine, a man loses his job. One version of consciousness interprets the event as personal failure and collapses into shame. Another interprets the same event as painful but necessary redirection toward growth. External circumstance remains identical. Internal transmutation changes the outcome entirely. Perception alters destiny. This is why ancient masters guarded attention so fiercely. Attention feeds emotion. Whatever the mind repeatedly focuses upon gains energetic momentum. A person obsessing over betrayal intensifies bitterness. A person consciously directing attention towards solutions gradually weakens despair's hold. Energy follows awareness as faithfully as rivers follow gravity. Attention is alchemy. A Roman Stoic once wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Hermetic initiates understood this literally. Repeated emotional states harden into temperament. Temperament shapes behavior. Behavior shapes destiny. Tiny reactions repeated daily become invisible architecture. One reaction changes everything. There is a dangerous misunderstanding today that spiritual power means remaining endlessly positive. Ancient traditions never taught this. They taught conscious transformation, not emotional denial. Fear must be understood before it can be redirected. Grief must be honored before wisdom emerges from it. Rage must be examined before becoming disciplined force. Fanta positivity weakens perception. Real mental transmutation requires honesty. A man pretending not to feel fear remains unconsciously ruled by it. A woman denying resentment continues projecting it onto others indirectly. The ancient path demanded confrontation with the inner world first. This is why initiates often entered isolation chambers or long periods of silence. They needed to witness the mind clearly without distraction. Stillness exposes hidden storms. One merchant from Antioch reportedly practiced a strange discipline whenever anger arose. Instead of reacting immediately, he walked beside the sea until the emotion lost its violent shape. Only then would he make decisions. Over decades he became known for unusual clarity under pressure, while others destroyed relationships through impulsive reaction. His power came not from suppressing emotion, but from mastering its direction. Calmness is trained. Hermetic alchemy was always symbolic as much as literal. Turning lead into gold represented the transformation of lower consciousness into higher awareness, fear into courage, chaos into order, impulse into wisdom. The greatest laboratory was never outside the human being. It was within. The true furnace is the mind, so begin noticing emotional momentum in real time. Watch irritation before it becomes aggression. Watch fear before it becomes paralysis. Watch envy before it becomes bitterness. Create space between feeling and reaction. In that space, power quietly returns. Master the reaction first, because the person who cannot direct their inner world will always remain vulnerable to the outer one. Chapter 7. Why most people reinforce the reality they fear. A strange paradox governs human experience. What you resist emotionally often grows stronger in perception. Ancient Hermetic students understood this long before psychology gave it language. They observed that consciousness does not merely observe reality, it organizes it, and whatever is emotionally charged becomes overrepresented in awareness, as if the mind begins searching for evidence to confirm its own tension. Fear, once repeated, becomes a kind of internal ritual. A merchant in old Tyre once feared bankruptcy so intensely that he began checking his ledgers obsessively, hour after hour, even when no real danger existed. At first he thought vigilance was wisdom, but over time, something subtle changed. He stopped noticing opportunities. Conversations became threats. Neutral events became warnings. His entire perception narrowed until only loss seemed visible. Eventually, he made the very decisions he feared most, not because failure was inevitable, but because his attention had already built a mental model of failure and begun living inside it. This is how psychological reality becomes physical consequence. Modern neuroscience echoes what ancient initiates already knew in symbolic form. Attention strengthens neural pathways. Emotion strengthens memory encoding. Repetition strengthens identity. What you repeatedly imagine with emotional intensity begins to feel familiar, and what feels familiar becomes your unconscious default behavior. Fear is not passive, it is creative, but in the wrong direction. Plato hinted at this when he described prisoners in the cave reacting emotionally to shadows. They did not question the source of their fear. They responded to it as truth. Similarly, modern consciousness often reacts to internal projections as if they were external facts. A worried mind imagines rejection, then behaves defensively, then receives distance from others, then interprets that distance as confirmation. A loop is formed, not by fate, but by feedback between thought and emotion and behavior. The mind becomes both architect and prisoner. An old Stoic teaching warns that imagination without discipline becomes suffering before experience. Marcus Aurelius noted that the soul is shaped by its impressions, and that unchecked interpretation distorts reality more than reality itself. In other words, the mind can suffer an event long before it happens, or even if it never happens at all. This is the hidden cost of emotional rehearsal. When a person repeatedly imagines worst-case scenarios, the nervous system begins to treat those imagined futures as probable realities. The body responds with stress. Behavior tightens. Creativity declines. Opportunities are missed not because they do not exist, but because perception is already locked inside expectation of loss. Fear narrows the field of possibility. And what is not seen cannot be chosen. Ancient initiates treated imagination carefully for this reason. They understood it as a force that could either elevate consciousness or trap it in cycles of prediction and self-fulfilling prophecy. In certain Egyptian mystery traditions, students were taught to visualize not only what they desired, but to observe their emotional reaction to uncertainty itself. The goal was not suppression of fear, but transformation of its influence. Because what controls emotion controls interpretation. A farmer once observed that during drought seasons, his neighbors would panic early, overreact, and abandon fields too soon. He, however, remained steady, not because he denied difficulty, but because he refused to let fear dictate timing. Some seasons were indeed harsh, but panic always made them worse. His calm perception allowed him to act with precision instead of collapse. Over years, his land remained stable while others oscillated between loss and recovery. The difference was not intelligence. It was emotional direction. Fear becomes dangerous not because it exists, but because it repeats without interruption. Each repetition reinforces neural expectation. Each expectation shapes attention. Each attention pattern filters reality. Eventually, a person no longer sees life as it is, but only as their emotional conditioning allows. This is why ancient teachings consistently return to awareness of thought, not control of external events. The external world is too vast to govern directly, but internal interpretation is immediate and always available. Where attention goes, experience follows, and where emotional attention lingers, identity forms. So the instruction is simple, though not easy. Stop emotionally rehearsing feared outcomes, not by suppression, but by interruption. Notice when the mind begins constructing scenarios of loss, rejection, failure, or instability. Do not argue with them. Do not feed them. Return attention to the present field of action, because fear loses power when it is not rehearsed. The ancient Hermetic principle hidden beneath this psychology is clear. Consciousness is creative, but it is also directional. It builds what it repeatedly inhabits. If you dwell in imagined catastrophe, you slowly train perception to expect catastrophe. If you dwell in grounded awareness, perception expands again. The mind is always practicing something. The only question is what. And whatever is practiced silently becomes destiny loudly. Chapter 8. The war between inner and outer worlds. One dominates the other, always. This is the hidden conflict every human being lives inside without realizing it. The outer world appears dominant. Events, people, circumstances, delays, opportunities and obstacles. Yet beneath all of this is a quieter force that ancient traditions consistently placed above circumstance itself, the inner world of interpretation, belief, and emotional certainty. Hermetic philosophy called this the realm of mind. Stoicism called it judgment. Eastern traditions called it awareness. Modern psychology calls it cognition. But all point to the same invisible battlefield, the space where reality is assigned meaning before it is ever experienced consciously. Most people assume the outer world shapes the inner world. Ancient initiates taught the opposite. A traveler in Alexandria once studied under a Hermetic teacher known for his unusual calm. During periods of political unrest, when markets collapsed and rumors of war spread through the city, students expected him to react like everyone else. Instead, he would sit in silence, observing the same events without emotional collapse. When asked how he remained unaffected, he replied, "The outer world moves like wind. The inner world decides whether to be sail or anchor. This distinction is everything. The outer world delivers raw data. The inner world interprets it. One is event. The other is meaning, and meaning determines response, behavior, and eventual outcome. Two people can experience identical circumstances and walk away with entirely different psychological realities. One becomes fearful, the other becomes focused. One contracts, the other adapts. The war is not about events, it is about interpretation. Plato's cave returns here again in a deeper form. The shadows are not only external illusions, they are internal interpretations projected outward. The prisoner does not merely see shadows, he believes them. That belief shapes his emotional reality, and emotional reality shapes his decisions. Thus, the cave is not just ignorance of the world, it is ignorance of perception itself. Marcus Aurelius wrote during times of plague and war that suffering is not caused by events but by judgment of events. This is not philosophical abstraction, it is operational psychology. The same event interpreted differently produces different biological and behavioral outcomes. Stress hormones, attention narrowing, and decision-making all shift depending on interpretation. The outer world does not command meaning, the inner world assigns it. A man once lost his business in a sudden market crash. One version of him collapsed into despair and saw himself as defeated permanently. Another version, trained in stoic reflection, saw the collapse as information rather than identity. One interpretation ended his trajectory, the other redirected it. The external event was identical. The internal world determined the outcome. This is the silent dominance of consciousness. Ancient Hermetic initiates trained precisely for this battlefield. Their goal was not to control events, but to remain sovereign in interpretation. They understood that reality is always filtered through layers of perception, memory, belief, emotion, expectation. These layers can distort or clarify depending on discipline. Inner disorder produces outer confusion. Inner stability produces outer adaptability. This is why initiates often engaged in practices of withdrawal, silence and contemplation, not to escape the world, but to refine the instrument through which the world is experienced. A distorted lens produces distorted reality. A calm mind produces accurate perception. The war, then, is not external, it is internal governance. And governance determines reality more than circumstance ever will. Modern life intensifies this war. Constant stimulation, information overload, and emotional manipulation fragment attention. When attention fragments, interpretation becomes unstable. When interpretation becomes unstable, identity becomes reactive. And when identity becomes reactive, the outer world appears chaotic even when it is merely being filtered poorly. Nothing outside has changed, but everything inside has. The hermetic solution is not escape, it is alignment. To stabilize the inner world so perception becomes clear again. To observe interpretation before it becomes reaction. To recognize that emotional response is not reality itself, but commentary on reality, and commentary can be rewritten. The true victory is not control over the outer world. It is mastery over the meaning assigned to it. Because once the inner world is ordered, the outer world is no longer overwhelming, it becomes readable. And what is readable can be navigated. Chapter 9. The Principle of Correspondence. As above, so below, as within, so without. This ancient hermetic axiom was never meant as poetry alone. It was a map of perception, a statement that reality is not split into separate domains of inner and outer, but is instead a continuous reflection between states of consciousness and experienced life. What you carry internally does not remain hidden. It reorganizes how the world appears to you, and eventually how you move within it. Ancient initiates treated this principle as a law of alignment. Not moral alignment, but structural alignment. If the inner world is fragmented, perception becomes fragmented. If the inner world is ordered, perception becomes coherent. The outer world then appears to shift, not because matter itself is instantly rewritten, but because awareness begins selecting, interpreting, and responding differently. The mirror is always active. A merchant in ancient Athens once noticed a strange pattern in his life. Whenever he entered periods of internal anxiety, worrying about trade, reputation, or loss, his external world seemed to mirror that tension. Clients became difficult. Negotiations collapsed. Small misunderstandings multiplied. At first he blamed circumstance, but over time he noticed something unsettling. Even neutral situations began bending toward conflict when his internal state was unstable. He sought counsel from a philosopher who told him something simple: "Your world is learning your mood." At first, he dismissed it, but observation changed him more than argument ever could. When he entered calm states, even difficult conversations softened. When he entered reactive states, even simple interactions became tense. The external world did not change first. His interpretation did. This is the hidden mechanism of correspondence. Modern psychology echoes this ancient insight. Cognitive science shows that emotional states shape attention. Attention shapes perception. Perception shapes interpretation. Interpretation shapes behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. The external world, in many ways, becomes a delayed reflection of repeated internal patterns, not instantly, but consistently. Emotional habits are not private. They leak into decision-making, tone, timing, risk assessment, and relational behavior. Over time, these micro-decisions accumulate into life trajectories. What appears as external destiny is often an internal repetition expressed outwardly. This is why ancient alchemists used symbolic language of transformation. Lid into gold was not simply a physical fantasy, it was a metaphor for inner refinement. Lid represented dense, unexamined emotional patterns. Gold represented clarity, awareness, and disciplined perception. The transformation was psychological before it was symbolic. Inner disorder becomes outer turbulence. A man who carries unresolved fear does not merely feel fear. He interprets neutrality as threat. He anticipates rejection before it occurs. He subtly communicates hesitation. Others respond to that signal unconsciously. The world appears to reject him, but in truth, he is already rejecting himself internally before interaction begins. Correspondence is not punishment. It is reflection. In the temples of ancient Egypt, initiates were taught to observe their emotional reactions as omens, not of fate, but of internal condition. If inner agitation appeared, it was seen as a signal to restore order before engaging the outer world. They believed that acting from internal chaos only multiplied external confusion. A disturbed mind creates disturbed navigation. A story from early Hermetic tradition describes a young initiate who complained that life was unfair. He said misfortune followed him constantly. The teacher led him to a polished bronze surface and asked him to look into it while making different facial expressions. When he smiled, the reflection smiled. When he frowned, the reflection changed instantly. The teacher said, "The world is not happening to you. It is happening through you." The initiate did not understand immediately, but over time, he noticed that his emotional states preceded his external experiences more often than he realized. When he stabilized internally, outcomes stabilized externally. Not because he controlled events directly, but because he changed the conditions through which he engaged with them. This is correspondence in motion. The principle does not claim that thoughts magically rewrite physical reality in isolation. Instead, it reveals something more precise and psychologically grounded. Inner states shape perception, perception shapes behavior, and behavior shapes the trajectory of lived experience. The mirror is behavioral continuity over time. What repeats within becomes pattern without. Modern life often ignores this mechanism and focuses only on external adjustment. But ancient wisdom repeatedly returns inward first, because no sustainable change occurs externally without first reorganizing the internal system that generates interpretation. You do not merely live in reality. You participate in its interpretation, and interpretation is always conditioned by inner order. So the instruction becomes simple, though not easy. Stabilize internal reactions first, not suppress them, not deny them. Stabilize them through awareness. Observe emotional turbulence without immediately converting it into action or identity. Create space between impulse and behavior. In that space, correspondence can shift, because the mirror only reflects what is consistently held in front of it. Chapter 10. The Principle of Polarity. An emotional storm always feels absolute while it is happening. Fear feels total. Anger feels consuming. Sadness feels permanent. Yet ancient Hermetic teaching introduces a quiet disruption to this experience. All opposites are part of the same continuum. Fear and courage are not separate forces. They are different degrees of the same energetic spectrum. So are love and hate, hope and despair, clarity and confusion. Nothing is truly separate, only positioned differently. This realization changes how transformation occurs. A man standing at the edge of despair does not need to leap instantly into confidence. That attempt usually fails. Instead, he needs to understand that despair and confidence are not different substances. They are different intensities of interpretation. Movement between them is gradual, not absolute. Ancient initiates knew this. They did not force emotional states. They shifted them, a slow recalibration of perception, in a Greek philosophical school influenced by early Hermetic thought. Students were sometimes placed in reflective exercises during emotional extremes. If a student was overwhelmed by fear, the teacher would not deny the fear. Instead, he would ask, "Where is the smallest trace of steadiness within this fear?" The student would search until he found even a fraction of calm. That fraction became the starting point of transformation. Because polarity always contains its opposite. Fear contains awareness. Anger contains clarity of boundary. Sadness contains depth of understanding. The principle of polarity teaches that transformation is not destruction of emotion, but movement through it along a continuum. A traveler once crossed a desert guided by a Bedouin elder. During the journey, the traveler panicked when storms approached. The elder did not tell him to stop fearing. Instead, he said, "Fear is wind. Walk slightly differently, and it becomes caution instead of collapse." The lesson was subtle but profound. Emotional energy does not need elimination. It needs direction. Force creates resistance, but awareness creates movement. Modern psychology reflects this ancient insight in emotional regulation theory. Suppression intensifies emotional rebound. Acceptance reduces intensity. But Hermetic teaching goes further. It suggests that awareness can shift the position on the emotional spectrum itself, not by denial, but by conscious repositioning of interpretation. Fear begins to soften when observed without narrative escalation. Anger begins to transform when its underlying need is recognized. Despair begins to loosen when its permanence is questioned. Ancient initiates trained for this by deliberately exposing themselves to controlled extremes. Not for suffering, but for mastery. They learned that emotional states are not fixed identities. They are temporary positions of consciousness, and anything that can be positioned can be repositioned. Polarity makes transformation possible. Without it, change would be impossible. If fear and courage were unrelated states, transition between them would require external force. But because they exist on the same spectrum, movement becomes internal adjustment rather than external replacement. A man in ancient Alexandria once lost his wealth and entered a state of deep despair. A philosopher asked him, "Is your despair complete, or does a part of you still observe it?" The man paused. In that pause, something shifted. He realized there was still awareness watching the despair. That awareness was not broken, it was stable. From that recognition, recovery began, not as sudden happiness, but as gradual movement toward balance. This is polarity in lived experience. Transformation is not instant reversal. It is directional movement along a continuum of awareness. The goal is not to erase emotion. It is to stop mistaking emotional intensity for final truth. Because every extreme contains the seed of its opposite, and every state can become another state when understood clearly enough. So the teaching becomes this: when caught in emotional extremes, do not fight the state. Locate its opposite within it. Find the smallest trace of calm inside fear, the smallest trace of clarity inside confusion, the smallest trace of strength inside doubt. That trace is the doorway, and through it, movement begins. Chapter 11. Rhythm. The hidden pendulum of life. There are moments in life when everything rises effortlessly, clarity feels natural, opportunities appear aligned, and the mind seems expanded beyond its usual limits. Then, without warning, the atmosphere shifts. Energy drops, motivation thins, thoughts become heavier. The same world that felt open now feels constricted. Ancient Hermetic teachers observed this pattern and named it rhythm, the hidden pendulum governing emotional, psychological, and experiential states. Nothing remains static. Every force swings between poles, expansion and contraction, clarity and confusion, strength and fatigue. This was not seen as failure of discipline, but as the natural movement of life itself. A young student in an old Egyptian mystery school once approached his mentor in distress. He said, "Yesterday I felt invincible. Today I feel like I've lost everything I've learned." The mentor did not correct him. Instead, he led him to a courtyard where a hanging bronze bell swayed slowly back and forth in the wind. "Do you think the bell is broken because it moves?" he asked. The student shook his head. The mentor replied, "Then why do you think you are broken when you move between states? Rhythm is not disorder. It is structure in motion. Ancient sages did not attempt to eliminate this swing. They learned to anticipate it. They understood that emotional highs naturally carry the seed of return, and emotional lows naturally contain the seed of recovery. The mistake of ordinary perception is not experiencing the swing, but believing each phase is permanent. When a person is in an elevated state, they often overextend, making decisions, promises, and assumptions based on peak emotion. When the swing reverses, they interpret the descent as failure. This misinterpretation deepens suffering far more than the rhythm itself. Stoic philosophers, particularly Marcus Aurelius, warned against this distortion. He observed that the mind exaggerates both pleasure and pain when it forgets their temporary nature. Stability in Stoic understanding is not emotional suppression, but emotional recognition without attachment. You are not your current state. You are the awareness moving through states. Modern psychology aligns with this ancient observation through what is now known as affective variability, the natural fluctuation of emotional tone across time. People who suffer most are not those who experience fluctuation, but those who resist it internally. Resistance creates tension. Tension amplifies suffering. Ancient initiates developed a different approach. They cultivated what could be called rhythmic intelligence, the ability to observe emotional cycles without over-identification. When energy rose, they remained grounded. When energy fell, they remained observant. In both cases, they refused to convert temporary states into permanent identity. A traveler once crossed the desert with a caravan guided by a nomadic philosopher. One night, during rest, the traveler became anxious because his mind felt unusually clear and then suddenly heavy within the same hour. He asked the philosopher whether something was wrong with him. The philosopher responded, "The sky does not stop being sky because weather passes through it." That distinction changes everything. Rhythm becomes less threatening when it is understood as movement within a larger stillness. The stillness is awareness itself. When a person identifies with emotional peaks, they become inflated during highs and collapse during lows. But when they identify with awareness, both become observable phenomena rather than defining truths. This shift is subtle but profound. It transforms experience from identity into observation, and observation restores choice. The hidden danger of rhythm is not the swing itself, but unconscious reaction during the swing. Overreaction during highs leads to overcommitment. Overreaction during lows leads to withdrawal, doubt, and fragmentation. Both extremes reinforce instability. Neutrality does not mean indifference. It means continuity of awareness across change. Ancient Taoist teachings describe this as flowing with the wave without becoming the wave. Water rises, falls, crashes, and becomes still again, but it remains water throughout. Its identity is not altered by motion. In practical terms, rhythm teaches restraint during emotional expansion and patience during contraction. The initiate learns not to amplify either extreme through narrative. Instead, they maintain internal observation while external conditions shift. This creates something rare: emotional continuity. Over time, this continuity stabilizes perception. Decisions become less reactive, identity becomes less fragile. Life feels less like a sequence of unpredictable collapses and more like a structured movement that can be understood rather than feared. The rhythm does not disappear, but suffering decreases as interpretation changes. And when interpretation changes, experience changes with it. So the action becomes simple, remains centered during emotional cycles, not by resisting the swing, but by refusing to confuse the swing with the self. Because the pendulum moves, but the observer does not. Chapter 12. Becoming the architect of reality. At a certain point in every philosophical tradition explored in this work, Hermeticism, Stoicism, Plato's metaphysics, Taoist flow, and even modern psychology, there emerges a single convergence. Human beings are not merely observers of reality, but participants in its formation through perception, interpretation, and sustained attention. This is the shift from passive existence to conscious authorship. Most people live as if reality is something that happens to them. Circumstances arrive first, and consciousness reacts afterward. In this model, the external world is primary, and the internal world is secondary. But ancient initiates inverted this order. They trained themselves to see consciousness not as a reflection of reality, but as the field through which reality is continuously structured. To become the architect of reality is not to control every external event. It is to govern the internal conditions that shape how events are perceived, interpreted, and responded to. This governance determines behavior. Behavior determines outcomes. Outcomes reinforce perception, and perception loops back into consciousness. Thus, reality is not static, it is recursive. A young student once asked a Hermetic teacher how one becomes powerful in the world. The teacher took him to a partially built temple and asked him to watch the builders. Stones were placed one by one, carefully aligned. "Do you see power here?" the teacher asked. The student hesitated and said, "It looks slow." The teacher replied, "That is because you are watching construction, not creation. Creation begins before stone is moved." He was pointing to consciousness as blueprint. Modern psychology would describe this in terms of self-concept and predictive processing. The brain does not passively record reality. It predicts it based on internal models. These models shape what is noticed, what is ignored, and how meaning is assigned. In other words, perception is not reception, it is construction. Plato understood this deeply in his allegory of the cave. The prisoners did not simply see shadows, they organized their entire understanding of existence around them. When one prisoner leaves the cave, the difficulty is not in seeing light, it is in restructuring identity after long exposure to limitation. This is the real challenge of transformation, not external change, but internal re-architecture. The Stoics approach this by emphasizing disciplined interpretation. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself that events are neutral until judgment is applied. Epictetus taught that what disturbs people is not things, but opinions about things. These teachings converge on the same principle. Reality is filtered through mind before it is experienced as world. Therefore, to change experience, one must first change the filter. Ancient initiates understood this as craftsmanship of consciousness. They did not attempt to dominate external forces blindly. Instead, they refined attention, stabilized emotional reactions, and trained perception to remain less distorted by fear, desire, or assumption. Over time, this created what could be called inner authorship, the ability to shape experience by shaping the lens through which experience is formed. A man in Alexandria once studied under multiple philosophical traditions. He noted something consistent across all teachings. When his inner state was chaotic, his life appeared chaotic. When his inner state was ordered, even external challenges became navigable. The difference was not in the world itself, but in his capacity to interpret and respond without distortion. He later wrote, "I did not change the world. I changed my participation in it." This is the essence of becoming an architect, not control over everything, but responsibility for inner formation. Modern life often encourages the opposite belief, that circumstances must shift before peace or success is possible. But ancient wisdom consistently reverses this order. Inner alignment precedes external coherence, not as magical thinking, but as psychological causation over time. A person who sees opportunity will act differently than one who sees limitation. A person who interprets uncertainty as danger will behave differently than one who interprets it as possibility. Over time, these differences accumulate into entirely different life trajectories. This is architecture in motion. The structure of experience is built through repeated internal patterns: thought, emotion, attention, reaction. These patterns become identity. Identity becomes behavior. Behavior becomes lived reality. Thus, architecture is always occurring. The only question is whether it is conscious or unconscious. To become conscious of this process is to reclaim authorship, not in the sense of controlling every outcome, but in the deeper sense of recognizing that internal design determines experiential structure. This is why all ancient systems ultimately return to awareness. Awareness interrupts unconscious repetition. Awareness introduces choice, and choice introduces direction. When awareness stabilizes, the architect awakens, and reality, once seen as external force, is revealed as participatory field, continuously shaped through the quiet but persistent movement of consciousness itself. Chapter 13. The Hidden War for Human Attention. What most people never realize is that attention is not passive. It is not simply looking or noticing. In ancient Hermetic and philosophical traditions, attention was treated as a form of energetic currency, something that is constantly being spent, directed, and harvested through experience. Where attention goes, consciousness follows. Where consciousness remains, identity is formed. This is why initiates in ancient schools considered attention more sacred than information. Information without attention is meaningless. But attention, even without information, begins to reshape the structure of the mind itself. It determines what becomes real to the perceiver. Modern life, however, operates as a continuous fragmentation of this force. A man living in Alexandria centuries ago might have had hours of uninterrupted thought, walking through quiet courtyards or observing craftsmen at work. Today, the average mind is interrupted every few seconds. Notifications, shifting images, competing narratives, emotional stimuli. Not because the world has become more complex, but because attention has become the most contested resource of consciousness. Ancient teachers would describe this as a scattering of the soul's lens. When attention is scattered, perception becomes unstable. When perception is unstable, identity becomes fragmented. And when identity is fragmented, decisions lose coherence. The person begins to feel as if they are many versions of themselves competing for control, instead of a unified center directing experience. This fragmentation is not just psychological, it is existential. In the mystery schools of Egypt, initiates underwent strict training in concentration. They were sometimes placed in silent chambers for extended periods, not to escape the world, but to refine their ability to hold awareness on a single object, thought, or symbolic image without distortion. The goal was not suppression of mind, but stabilization of focus. They understood something modern culture often forgets. A mind that cannot hold attention cannot hold direction. Without direction, manifestation becomes accidental rather than intentional. A wandering merchant in ancient Greece once consulted a philosopher after noticing a strange pattern in his life. He said, "I think about too many things at once, and nothing I want seems to stay with me." The philosopher replied, "You are not thinking too much, you are scattering what you think with." That distinction changed everything for him. Attention is not just input, it is force. When directed, it strengthens clarity. When scattered, it weakens identity. Modern psychology mirrors this ancient understanding through concepts like cognitive load and attentional residue. Every shift in focus carries a cost. Over time, fragmented attention reduces depth of thought, emotional stability, and even long-term goal formation. The mind becomes reactive instead of architecturally intentional. Ancient initiates would say, "A divided mind cannot hold creation." Focus, therefore, is not just productivity, it is alignment. It is the act of gathering consciousness into a single coherent line of force. When attention is unified, perception sharpens. When perception sharpens, decisions become precise. When decisions become precise, outcomes begin to align more consistently with intention. Not through magic, but through coherence. This is why traditions across cultures, from Stoic discipline to Taoist meditation, repeatedly emphasize control of attention over control of external events. Because attention governs interpretation, and interpretation governs reality as experienced. A story is told of a young initiate who struggled to maintain focus during meditation. His mind constantly drifted into fear, memory, imagination, regret. Frustrated, he asked his teacher how to eliminate distraction. The teacher responded, "You cannot eliminate movement in water, but you can learn to stop mistaking ripples for depth." Over time, the student learned to return attention gently without judgment. The mind did not become silent, but it became stable, and in that stability clarity emerged. This is the hidden law. Attention does not need perfection. It needs continuity. Even modern neuroscience acknowledges that sustained attention rewires neural pathways. Repetition of focus strengthens certain circuits while weakening others. What we consistently attend to becomes structurally dominant in the mind. In ancient language, this was called formation of inner reality. So the action is simple but demanding. Protect focus aggressively, not through rigidity, but through awareness of what fragments it. Every unnecessary shift of attention is a small dispersion of identity. Every reclaimed moment of focus is a reinforcement of inner structure. Because a scattered mind does not create, it reacts, and reaction is always downstream of control. Chapter 14. Thought as Invisible Architecture. Most people believe their life is shaped by external events, opportunities, relationships, timing, and circumstance. Yet beneath all of these visible movements lies something far less visible but far more influential: repeated thought. Thought is not a random occurrence. It is a structural force that, when repeated, begins to shape identity itself. Ancient philosophers understood this long before modern psychology gave it language. They observed that what a person repeatedly thinks becomes what they expect. What they expect becomes what they interpret. and what they interpret becomes what they respond to. Over time, this loop becomes personality. Invisible repetition creates visible behavior. A man in ancient Athens once noticed that his life always seemed to follow a familiar pattern: hesitation, missed opportunity, regret, and reflection. He sought guidance from a Stoic teacher. The teacher did not ask about his actions first. Instead, he asked, "What do you say to yourself when no one is listening?" The man paused. Then he realized something uncomfortable. His internal dialogue was filled with doubt long before any external failure occurred. The teacher responded, "You do not fail in action first. You fail in thought first." This is the architecture of experience. Modern cognitive science supports this ancient insight through schema theory, mental frameworks built from repeated thought and emotional reinforcement. These schemas filter perception, influencing what is noticed, what is ignored, and how events are interpreted. Over time, they become automatic. What begins as thought becomes lens. What becomes lens becomes life. Mental images are especially powerful in this process. The mind does not only think in words, it thinks in symbolic representations, scenarios, and imagined outcomes. These internal images influence emotional responses, which then influence decisions. A person who repeatedly imagines failure will unconsciously adjust behavior toward avoidance. A person who repeatedly imagines success will begin to move differently in uncertain situations. Neither is instant destiny, but both are directional formation. Ancient Hermetic teachings referred to this as inner engraving. Each repeated thought inscribes a subtle pattern into consciousness. Over time, these inscriptions become identity. And identity is the unseen architect behind every external outcome. A merchant in a later tradition once realized that every financial decision he made was preceded by a subtle internal assumption: scarcity, hesitation, fear of loss. Even when opportunities were present, his internal narrative filtered them as risky rather than possible. When he began observing this pattern, something shifted. Not immediately in his circumstances, but in his interpretation of them. That shift changed everything that followed, because when interpretation changes, behavior follows. And when behavior changes, outcomes eventually align. This is why ancient initiates placed extreme emphasis on interrupting unconscious thought loops. They understood that unchecked repetition becomes destiny in slow motion, not because thoughts directly control external reality, but because they determine the internal framework through which reality is navigated. To interrupt destructive thought loops is to interrupt automatic identity formation. This does not mean suppressing thoughts. It means recognizing them as patterns rather than truths. A thought repeated unconsciously becomes structure. A thought observed consciously becomes data, and data can be changed, so the action is simple, though not easy. Interrupt destructive loops as they arise. Not with force, but with awareness. Not with resistance, but with recognition, because the mind is always building something. The only question is whether it is building consciously or repeating what was never questioned. Chapter 15. Ignore reality without escaping responsibility. There is a misunderstanding that has followed Hermetic philosophy through centuries of interpretation. The idea that ignoring reality means denial, avoidance, or detachment from life itself. In truth, the original Hermetic implication is far more precise and far more disciplined. To ignore reality does not mean to reject what is happening. It means to refuse emotional enslavement to what is happening. This distinction is everything. Ancient initiates understood that external conditions are always present, always shifting, always incomplete. But interpretation, that is where sovereignty is either lost or reclaimed. Reality, in its raw form, is neutral data. It becomes suffering, pressure, or opportunity only through the lens of consciousness applied to it. A young seeker once approached a Hermetic teacher after losing his livelihood during a political upheaval. He said, "My reality has collapsed." The teacher responded calmly, "No, your interpretation of reality has collapsed." The seeker was confused. The teacher continued, "The world has not changed its nature. Your agreement with it has changed." This is the hidden core of the principle. To ignore reality in the Hermetic sense is to stop allowing appearances to dictate emotional state automatically. It is to interrupt the reflex that says, "Because this is happening, I must feel this way." Instead, consciousness inserts a pause, a space between stimulus and response. In that space, authority is restored. Stoic philosophers described this as separating impression from judgment. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that events do not disturb the mind, only the mind's interpretation does. Epictetus went further, teaching that external conditions are not within our control, but response always is. This is not passivity, it is precision. A merchant in ancient Tyre once lost a shipment of goods at sea. By ordinary standards, the situation was ruinous. Yet instead of collapsing into despair, he sat quietly and evaluated what remained under his control, his preparation, his interpretation, and his next action. He later rebuilt his entire trade network, not because the loss was insignificant, but because he refused to convert circumstance into identity. He did not deny the loss, he refused to become it. This is the difference between emotional slavery and conscious response. Modern psychology echoes this through cognitive reappraisal, the ability to reinterpret events in ways that reduce emotional distortion and increase adaptive action. What ancient systems described as detachment, modern systems describe as regulation. The principle remains the same. Perception determines experience more than event itself, but there is a deeper layer often missed. Detachment is not emotional numbness. It is emotional clarity. When the mind is not consumed by reaction, it becomes capable of observation, and observation reveals patterns that reaction hides. Reaction compresses awareness into immediate survival response. Observation expands awareness into strategic understanding. This is why initiates trained emotional distance, not to disconnect from life, but to perceive it more accurately. A temple student once asked his instructor how to remain unaffected by chaos. The instructor led him to a river and told him to place his hands into the water. "Can you stop the river?" he asked. The student laughed and said no. The instructor replied, "Then stop trying to become the river when it passes through you." This is the essence of conscious interpretation. You are not required to become the force you observe. Instead, you are required to remain the observer that chooses response. When this principle is applied, something subtle but powerful shifts. Action becomes deliberate instead of reactive. Decisions become aligned instead of impulsive. Emotional energy is no longer wasted on automatic resistance, and clarity increases. To ignore reality, then, is to refuse its emotional monopoly over consciousness, but not its responsibility, because Hermetic discipline is never about escaping consequence. It is about engaging consequence without distortion. Responsibility remains, but emotional collapse is removed from the equation. Action becomes cleaner, more precise, less burdened by unnecessary psychological noise. In practical terms, this means respond consciously instead of reacting emotionally. Not every stimulus deserves immediate identity-level response. Not every event requires emotional absorption. Many situations require only observation followed by measured action. This is sovereignty, not control over events, but control over internal interpretation of events. And in that control, freedom begins. Chapter 16. Reality mirrors identity. If Chapter 15 describes how interpretation governs experience, Chapter 16 reveals something even deeper. Identity governs interpretation. Most people believe they respond to reality. In truth, they respond through identity. A person who sees themselves as capable interprets challenges differently than a person who sees themselves as inadequate. A person who assumes scarcity interprets opportunity as risk. A person who assumes worthiness interprets uncertainty as possibility. The external world may be identical, but the internal architecture of identity filters it into entirely different experiences. Ancient initiates understood this long before modern psychology gave it terminology. They did not begin transformation with action. They began with identity restructuring. A student in an old philosophical lineage once asked why his efforts produced inconsistent results. Some days he acted with confidence and succeeded. Other days he acted with hesitation and failed. The teacher responded with a question, "Which version of yourself is acting?" The student was confused. The teacher clarified, "You are not one self, you are a pattern of selves. And whichever pattern is dominant will determine what reality you perceive as possible." This insight is crucial. Identity is not a static object. It is a recurring configuration of thoughts, emotions, expectations, and interpretations. And like all patterns, it strengthens through repetition. Modern psychology refers to this as self-schema, internalized beliefs about who one is. These schemas operate beneath conscious awareness, influencing attention, memory, and decision-making. A person does not see reality neutrally. They see it through the lens of who they believe themselves to be. This is why identical circumstances produce different lives for different people. Reality mirrors identity not by magic, but by selective perception and behavioral alignment. A man who believes he is unworthy will unconsciously avoid opportunities that require assertion. A person who believes they are competent will notice opportunities others overlook. Over time, these small differences accumulate into radically different life trajectories. Ancient teachings express this as, "The outer world reflects the inner form." But they also emphasize something more important. Identity can be reconstructed. A traveler once visited a remote school where initiates practiced what appeared to be simple daily exercises, walking, breathing, speaking, and observing thought patterns. There was no emphasis on external achievement. When asked why, the instructor replied, "We are not training behavior, we are training being." This distinction changes everything. Behavior without identity alignment is temporary. It collapses under pressure, but behavior emerging from identity becomes natural, automatic, and sustained. This is why motivation often fails. Motivation attempts to force behavior without changing the underlying identity structure that resists it. Once motivation fades, the old identity reasserts itself. But when identity shifts, behavior follows without force. This is the principle behind all lasting transformation. Even Plato's philosophy points toward this, through the idea that the visible world is shaped by deeper forms. The form precedes the manifestation. In psychological terms, self-concept precedes experience. In hermetic terms, inner pattern precedes outer expression. Thus, reality is not simply something you encounter. It is something you participate in constructing through identity-driven perception. The most important implication is this: identity directs attention unconsciously. What you believe yourself to be determines what you notice, and what you notice determines what you act upon. This creates a feedback loop that reinforces itself continuously. Therefore, transformation does not begin with changing circumstances. It begins with embodying a different internal identity, long enough for perception to reorganize around it. A Stoic would call this living in accordance with reasoned nature. A Hermeticist would call it aligning with the inner divine pattern. Modern psychology would call it cognitive restructuring. All point toward the same mechanism. Sustained identity alignment reshapes lived reality over time. So the action is simple in principle but profound in effect. Embody the desired identity emotionally, not as performance, but as internal consistency, because reality does not respond to what you wish you were. It responds to what you repeatedly assume yourself to be. Chapter 17. The Return to Hermetic Power. There is a moment in every tradition of inner philosophy where the teaching stops being about knowledge and becomes about responsibility. Hermeticism describes this as the return to power, not external power over the world, but internal governance over consciousness itself. Because according to the Hermetic understanding, preserved in texts like the Corpus Hermeticum, humanity does not merely observe reality. Humanity participates in it, not as passive witnesses, but as conscious co-creators through perception, attention, and interpretation. Yet something has been forgotten. Ancient teachers warned that when consciousness forgets its own role, it begins to mistake effects for causes. It begins to believe that the outer world is the origin of inner states, rather than the reflection of them. This inversion is subtle, but it changes everything. It turns the human being from an origin point of awareness into a reactionary surface shaped by circumstance. A student in a forgotten philosophical lineage once asked his teacher why most people seem trapped in cycles of repetition. Same fears, same patterns, same emotional outcomes. The teacher replied with a sentence that carried more weight than explanation. You are not seeing people, you are seeing unconscious participation in reality. This is the hidden rupture. When consciousness is untrained, it does not disappear, it disperses. It scatters across stimuli, opinions, memories, and fears. And in that scattered state, it becomes reactive rather than creative. But when consciousness is gathered, something ancient returns: clarity, intention, and influence, not over others but over perception itself. Hermetic tradition called this alignment with the divine mind, not as worship, but as recognition. The understanding that there is a structured intelligence behind experience, and that human awareness is capable of aligning with it when it becomes internally ordered. Disorder in thought creates distortion in perception. Clarity in thought creates coherence in experience. A merchant in an old Mediterranean port once experienced this shift after years of chaotic decision-making. He noticed that his greatest failures were not caused by external market conditions, but by his internal instability, impulsive fear, reactive ambition, emotional inconsistency. One day, after a severe loss, he withdrew from trade temporarily and began observing his thoughts instead of obeying them. At first, nothing changed externally, but internally, something reorganized. He began to notice that before every poor decision, there was a subtle emotional disturbance he had previously ignored, and before every stable decision, there was quiet clarity he had dismissed as insignificant. Over time, he learned to delay action until inner noise settled. His external life did not immediately transform, but his point of origin did. And that changed everything that followed. This is the Hermetic return to power, not control over outcomes, but control over origin of perception. Modern psychology echoes this through metacognition, the ability to observe one's own thinking. When thought becomes observable, it loses automatic authority. When it loses automatic authority, choice becomes possible, and where choice exists, repetition can be interrupted. This is responsibility in its purest form, not moral burden, but mental governance. To govern thoughts deliberately is not to suppress them. It is to recognize that every thought contributes to emotional atmosphere, and emotional atmosphere shapes perception of reality before any external action is taken. In this way, thought is not passive, it is formative. Ancient initiates understood this deeply. They did not attempt to eliminate thought. They trained awareness to remain sovereign within thought, like a ruler walking through a city rather than being carried by its crowds. The difference is subtle, but absolute. Because when consciousness is governed internally, external conditions lose their ability to define identity. And when identity is no longer defined by conditions, something stabilizes within the human being that does not depend on circumstance. That stability is the return of hermetic power, not supernatural control over reality, but clarity that is no longer easily distorted by it. And from that clarity, action becomes aligned rather than reactive. Chapter 18. The Final Law of Conscious Reality. At the foundation of Hermetic teaching lies a principle that is both simple and unavoidable. Consciousness and reality are not separate systems. They are continuous interaction. Reality responds not to isolated thoughts, but to sustained patterns of consciousness, thoughts repeated, emotions reinforced, attention consistently directed towards certain interpretations of experience. In this sense, life is not reacting to you, it is reflecting through you. This is why temporary change rarely lasts. A single insight can shift awareness momentarily, but without sustained observation, the old patterns reassert themselves. Emotional habits rebuild interpretation automatically unless they are consciously interrupted. A traveler once visited a secluded philosophical community where students were asked to perform a simple practice for 30 days. They were not instructed to change their circumstances. Instead, they were instructed to observe 3 things continuously: their dominant thoughts, their emotional reactions, and their interpretive assumptions about events. At first, they found it trivial. But as days passed, something unexpected happened. They began to notice that their external experiences felt different, even when nothing had changed objectively. The reason was not external transformation, it was internal recognition. They were no longer fully merged with their automatic responses. They were observing them, and observation creates distance. Distance creates choice. Choice creates transformation. This is the final law of conscious reality. What you repeatedly attend to becomes the atmosphere through which all experience is filtered. Thoughts do not simply exist in isolation. They generate emotional tone. That emotional tone becomes the background frequency of perception, and perception determines what is noticed, what is ignored, and how meaning is assigned to events. 2 people can live through the same situation and inhabit entirely different realities, not because the world is different, but because their internal atmospheres are different. One experiences threat. Another experiences challenge. One sees limitation. Another sees possibility. The difference is not external, it is atmospheric. Ancient Hermetic thinkers would describe this as vibration, but modern language would describe it as cognitive emotional state consistency. Regardless of terminology, the mechanism is the same. Internal repetition stabilizes external experience. This is why awareness becomes the most powerful practice, not because awareness changes reality instantly, but because it interrupts unconscious repetition long enough for new patterns to form. And this is where the final experiment emerges. A 30-day observation of consciousness itself, not attempting to fix everything at once, not forcing immediate transformation, but watching, carefully and consistently, how thoughts arise, how emotions follow, and how reactions shape interpretation. Over time, patterns become visible that were previously invisible, simply because they were automatic. And once something becomes visible, it can no longer fully control you, because unconscious patterns require invisibility to maintain authority. The moment they are seen clearly, their influence begins to weaken. This is why ancient traditions placed so much emphasis on witnessing consciousness, not as passive observation, but as active disentanglement from automatic identity formation. A Stoic would call this freedom from impression. A Hermeticist would call it alignment with mind. A modern psychologist would call it metacognitive awareness. But all describe the same shift, from being inside thought to observing thought. And in that shift, something profound happens. Reality does not stop responding. But the way it is experienced changes fundamentally, because the center of interpretation is no longer unconscious reaction, it is conscious presence, and presence cannot be easily manipulated by external fluctuation. So the final law is this: reality continuously responds to consciousness, but consciousness is only stable when it is observed. What you repeatedly feel becomes the emotional climate of your life. What you repeatedly attend to becomes the structure of your perception. What you repeatedly assume becomes the trajectory of your experience. And the final realization is unavoidable. What controls your attention eventually controls your reality.